Welcome and thank you for joining me. We've already got some folks in the live with us, so we're ready for a good conversation. But perhaps before we jump in, we could just give a short intro in terms of how we met and a little bit about you, and then we can dive into our conversation. But this conversation today is going to be a chat between Kendalyn and myself about the coaching work that we've done together over the years, and also, Kendalyn's experience of, navigating work, life, being a parent, being an emerging sort of people leader, if you will, and all the fun, wild ride that entails. So we'll get into that soon, but I just wanted to go ahead and give you a moment, Kendalyn, to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you before we dive in.
Well, this is exciting for me. This is my first attempt at an Instagram Live, so we now have success, which makes me very happy. Definitely get the energy from the success, despite all the challenges we have this morning. So, hi everyone. My name is Kendalyn DeRoll. I live in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. I'm a nonprofit leader. And I work specifically in youth development programming. So my real niche is preparing young people for whatever their next step is. And I think really one of my strengths is being able to create experiences for young people and support staff in making sure that they're able to support those young people in their next steps. Mm-hmm. I'm also a mother of two amazing children. Alex is 6 and Abby is almost 4, which is crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. And I see myself really as an advocate for positive change, both in my personal and my professional life. I feel like since the pandemic, I've really changed a lot. That was a very pivotal time for me, as it was for a lot of people, and a lot of self-evaluation there. And of course, my work with Ellen kind of lines up with that. It was definitely a big part of that. Something just kind of fun to share is that I'm a big sister. So I was actually an only child until I was 16. And I have a blended family, both on my mom and my dad's side. And so I have 6 younger siblings who range in age from 22 to 17. So in this, working with young people, my worlds are kind of merging here because my 2 youngest brothers are actually graduating. They're the last 2 to graduate from high school this year, and they're making plans for their next steps. So it's very exciting and interesting, like working with young people and then, helping my siblings sort of travel that same path. So
absolutely. And it's nice, I think, for people to also hear a bit about your personal story and how all of this intersects, because I think everyone can relate to their own version of not only the pandemic, but just like the change and the transformation that we've sort of experienced in our lives since then, all the things that it made us reconsider, the ways we've had to adapt, the things we thought were going to happen that happened differently. So I think, it's good to hear a little glimpse of behind the scenes. We've got another Chicagoan or a former Chicago resident in the house. She just let us know. Fabienne, thanks for letting us know. She was in Chicago for 25 years. And so Kendall and I met in Chicago, and we started our coaching partnership 3 years ago, I guess it was, which seems wild to think about, in January 2021. So we were deep in pandemic, and we have had the chance to work together a couple of times. We haven't been, consistently doing sessions every month of the last 3 years, but we've had a couple of different chances to work together over that time. And the most recent was just at the end of last year. And as we were sort of reflecting and talking about the journey and sort of marveling at this experience we've been on together, we thought, it would be a really great and uplifting and inspiring story to just share with other people who perhaps are also at a turning point of, making things work for themselves, figuring out who they want to be at work, but also navigating, challenges and new things and new phases at home. So this is just a chance for us to share a bit about how that went for you and what we did together. So we can go ahead and dive into it. I'm going to basically turn it over to Kendall and I'll just be asking a couple questions to guide us. And the first one is I want you to just sort of transport yourself back to 2020. And that's a big ask, I think, for a lot of us, but just to imagine and to share with us like what life was like before we began this journey together in coaching. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so 2020, so March 2020, we went home, right? We were going to be going home for a couple of weeks, and I was 9 months pregnant. So my daughter was actually born March 31st of
Mhm.
2020, and um, I really don't remember much of the summer. Was a
Mm.
lot having a baby in the pandemic, not having a lot of the support that I had had with my son, and my family and I, we live in 1,100 square feet with a newborn, a 3-year-old at the time, a very high maintenance dog, and working from home, it was a lot. So I was also battling postpartum depression
Mhm.
pretty significantly, and as I was coming back from work, right, I had this idea that I was going to ease myself in. Turns out when I came back to work, everything was a
Mhm.
mess.
Yeah.
The everybody was learning how to do their job again, and
Right.
everybody else also had like a 3-month head start on me because I hadn't been working.
Right.
I had been on maternity leave, so coming back, I was supposed to kind of work these shorter hours and ease my way in.
Mhm.
That just didn't happen.
Yeah.
Um, and I was also a relatively new supervisor. So I'd been supervising maybe about a year, but we had had a lot of turnover on our team. And that really is like a place of fear for me is
Mhm.
working in nonprofit. The turnover rate is high.
Mhm.
And that really impacts the team. And so I was really, wanting to keep this team together. Um,
Yeah.
and right after I returned, had a one of my direct reports leave, and just we're trying to figure out how to do our jobs, and it was a lot. I
Mhm.
mean, nonprofit can be very much like survival mode. You're just putting out, going from fire to fire, putting them out,
Yeah.
and trying to navigate that, the technology piece, which
Right.
you can see is not necessarily my strong suit, as well as you know trying to do all this with a baby, with a baby, not sleeping.
Right.
So it was a lot, and I think the major thing that I wanted to be able to do is create a workplace culture and a team culture that made people want to stay and made people want to work.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't really have the skills to do that. I was kind of put in a supervisory role because I was good at my job, but I never got any formal training on how to supervise people
Yeah.
and what that looks like.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm finding now that that seems to be a common theme, which is like, you get these promotions and you get these new experiences, but you don't really get any formal training or support other than maybe from your direct supervisor. So
Yeah.
um, I really wanted to learn how to make a team culture and learn how to be a better supervisor and a better leader.
Mhm.
And that was kind of the place where I met Ellen sort of through a fluke.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's how our journey began.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking us back there, even though it's maybe a hard place to visit. Um, but I just want to acknowledge what you said about like all these transitions happening on top of each other. So not only was it a pandemic and everyone in the world was trying to figure out how do we work, but you also had a newborn baby. You returned 3 months into the pandemic shift in the workplace. So you were trying to figure out how do we even do remote meetings and all this stuff. And you were managing a team that was also just human beings struggling in a pandemic, and doing that without a lot of training or support around how to be a manager. And I think you mentioned this point that so many people I think can relate to, which is like when you're good at your job, you get promoted and then you get to become management without ever having, been supported in transitioning to that, or, then having to do your work through a team of people when you could do it faster, or you could, that's the part you know how to do, not the part of guiding them to do it necessarily. So I think that's, yeah, something very relatable that a lot of us go through at some point or another. Um, and I'm wondering, like you mentioned, um, the transitions in this moment. We have worked together now through a couple of other transitions in terms of um, changing to a new organization and having new challenges there, new types of teams and collaborative projects that you're working across. Like, would you say that there were any moments that sort of stuck out along the way of your coaching journey where you were like, okay, I'm starting to see that this is working for me, or like, I can tell I've grown in this area because you have really been through so many different things?
Yeah, I mean there are quite a few. I mean, one was being in that role and in that moment. My Me and one of my direct reports had been through many transitions together, and that had kind of bonded us, but in kind of a strange way that we were almost like trauma bonded together by the
Mm-hmm.
turnover and the work and all that stuff. Um, and I think that the thing that kind of clicked for me was to be the supervisor for that person, be the supervisor that he needed, and not necessarily the supervisor that I needed. Like I knew
Yeah.
from previous supervisors, the supervisor I didn't want to be, but I didn't really know how to be the supervisor that he needed, and that was something
Mm-hmm.
different. Um,
Yes.
and I definitely like see a strength now, which is having intentional conversations with my direct reports, asking them what works best for them, how do they like to receive feedback, and being really intentional about that. And I think also asking for what I need in the relationship as well. Like communication is super important to me. Like I want to be in the loop on
Mm-hmm.
things, because I like to be able to trust that things are going
Yeah.
on. Um, and so that's just super helpful. It's just like keeping me in the loop and letting me know where I can support this, where do you need help and what does that look like for you? So that
Yeah.
was something pretty major. And then coming into this new role, my program is very intentionally collaborative. Um, my program kind of tacks on to the end of two other
Mm-hmm.
large, very large existing programs, and
Mm-hmm.
involved me learning, their program culture, their team culture, how they operate, how they communicate,
Yep.
different styles, as well as I inherited a lot of the distaste for my program that
Mm-hmm.
came from previous interactions that had nothing to do with me.
Right.
And there was one moment in a conversation with Ellen where we were just talking about that, like navigating that, and I was like, yeah, I just have to trust the process. And I had mentioned like we have the right people, like why isn't this working? And Ellen said to me, trust the people, like trust the people. And I think that for me was definitely like a clicking moment of like, okay, I know the right people are in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Let me trust those people and have some vulnerability and like ask for what I need, and get us on the same page. And so I think that's kind of been a major shift for me
Yeah.
is um, having that trust for other people and being willing to be like, these are the things that I need to do my job. But the vulnerability and like the relationship connecting has been super important, not just with supervisees, but also with partner work, because
Yeah.
that's how you build trust is through that vulnerability and like direct communication.
Absolutely. And I'm just smiling because it's so fun for me to think back to some of our earlier conversations and just, what it was like to approach some of these things in new ways than the ways that you had necessarily learned or sort of just done innately. And you've always been someone who is a really good connector and very relational and very, engaging in terms of bringing people in and making them feel included. And I think what you learned as a part of this process was just ways to do that that were effective in these different kinds of settings, right? In a one-to-one, management setting, in a collaborative, team setting where you were coming in with a lot of history already there, right? That like you were able to sort of apply yourself in these ways that weren't inherently against your nature, but that just required different things from you, right? That vulnerability, that expression of your own needs, that reaching out to say like, what is it that you need? What does this team need? What am I missing? Um, and allowing people to, and trusting people to tell you, right? To give you
Yep.
that information. And so that's again, like another sort of relatable hurdle on this path when people, advance in their careers and they get into more complex roles. And I also just want to shout out, Natalia mentioned a comment that like a large number of supervisors don't receive any training on how to lead a team. And
Absolutely.
so she wanted to commend you on having the awareness to seek support outside with a little muscle emoji. So
Thank
uh,
you so much.
yeah, and I think it's so true, right? It's just one of those big gaps in organizational and company support for their employees, which is what sends a lot of people to coaches is like, oh, how do I do this new thing that no one ever taught me how to do? But I want to sort of make a link now um, to your personal life in some ways, right? Because not only had you been figuring out how to navigate all this stuff in a work setting and with your direct reports and with these various teams and collaborators, but like you're also figuring out how to raise kids and like all the dynamics of that. And I'm just curious if there have been any things that have trickled into your personal life or just stuff that you've noticed about yourself since doing some of this work that ripples beyond your everyday work environment.
Yeah, I mean, think through this process, I've become a lot more self-aware. There was a level of self-awareness that was missing and that I've gained through this process.
Mm-hmm.
I made the joke, I would make the joke with Ellen as we were going through this of like, okay, here's another therapy session. Like I'm about to bring up, something from my childhood that is the reason why I act the way that I do, or something in my past like work experience that makes me react this way. And through like intentionally thinking and reflecting on those practices and where they come from, I was able to kind of be like, these are the ones that I like, and these are the ones I don't. And I'm going to be more intentional and thoughtful about how I go about changing
Mm-hmm.
them. I think there are lots of parallels with being a supervisor and being a parent, right? And I think, for each of your children, like you can't parent them the same way. Like they just need different
Mm-hmm.
things. They have
Yeah.
different personalities. They have different strengths. And so there's definitely a parallel there in terms of being like, oh, well, all the things that I did with Alex, like they don't work with Abby because she's a different person. And she's a lot more stubborn than he is. Um, and yeah, I think the idea of like clear expectations, like being really clear about what I need. And something else is like being willing to admit when I make a mistake is really important to me, both in work and at home, because
Yeah.
we're learning and we're developing and being okay with that growth mindset, modeling that for people around me, I think is incredibly important. And being okay with like, I'm gonna screw things up. Like that's parenting is like again, talking about things that you don't get training on, right? Like you don't get training on how to be a parent. They're like,
Yeah.
here's a baby, raise it, make it a good person.
Yeah.
And you're just a lot of times you're just figuring it out as you go. And
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I mean, a lot of that just reflection on myself and how I want to show up really has impacted how I parent, how I partner
Mm-hmm.
with my husband,
Yeah.
and also like my relationship with my mom, just like being able to admit like this was a behavior that I did, but I don't want to do that anymore. And I'm gonna behave like this now and I'm gonna change
Mm-hmm.
it and like speaking it into existence. So
Yeah. Well, that's huge. I just want to give you a lot of credit for not only doing this, but also just like the conscious nature of it, right? Of like, even when this stuff is hard to face up to or to acknowledge, like you actually did the opposite, which is to like sort of bravely use that in your life and not only with your children, which is, complex and challenging enough, but like actually then to go the other direction to your parent, because I think so many of us, at least in my experience with my clients, like some of what we're unwinding and unlearning and shining a light on is what we learned from our parents, right? And that doesn't make them wrong or bad, but it does mean that there's a dynamic there. And as we start to shift and change and choose different things for ourselves, right? That like it could also impact our relationships with those people who have always seen us a certain way or are used to a certain behavior. Um,
Mhm.
so I want to give you credit for that. Um, and speaking of parenting, I'm wondering if you have anything you want to say to other working parents who are out there wanting to build their careers, wanting to be leaders, but also balancing family life. Is there anything you would say? I know there's no magic tip, but just want to give you the chance to share what you've learned or offer anything.
Yeah, I mean, so I remember the first time I heard the term work-life balance, and I had to be like maybe 20, just, a couple of years out of college, and I had a friend who worked at Google, and they were talking about work-life balance. Um, and, I mean, this term is, I think, something that is kind of thrown around as though you only have two parts, right? You have work and you have
Mhm.
life, which is a little bit strange to me because work is part of your life. It's not like this extra thing.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the biggest thing for me and just has been like finding a workplace who will really support my professional growth. And I've been very lucky to have a supervisor um, who who prioritizes that.
Yeah.
And I think, not just do they talk
Mhm.
about it and like say they're going to do it, but like how are they putting funding behind it? How are they you know, what are the tangible ways that you see that? Because as you're developing, your needs are going to change, and
Yeah.
you're going to need different things. And so
Yeah.
I it's a lot of, I feel like the work-life balance conversation is a lot of talk and no action. And so what is the real action?
Mhm.
And then I think something else that I've learned to do is like set boundaries and encourage other people to do the same. So like I've had real conversations with my supervisor about like, hey, when you take PTO, but then you're still in a meeting, that makes me think that if I'm not doing that, then I'm not a hard worker, right? And I want to be perceived as a hard worker. So I have to work even when I'm not supposed to be working.
Mhm.
Like having those conversations and saying, like, please, if you're on PTO, please take your PTO. Like, trust your team to kind of, handle things for you. And I think that's something that I've done pretty well in my current team is really like we pick up for each other. We've been together not even quite a year, but we've had several like once in a lifetime
Mhm.
emergencies happen in our team, and we just pick up for each other. That's the type of culture that we have. When you're on
Mhm.
PTO, you don't work. Like
Yeah.
that's the expectation.
Yeah.
Um,
Huge.
and I think so, it's reinforcing those boundaries and doing it both up and down.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, which can definitely be a challenge, but
Yeah.
you know, you have to kind of be the change that you want to see in your workplace in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I think that's
Um,
huge.
yeah. And then I think the last thing is just as a parent, as a working parent, right? I mean, there's no matter what you do, right? As a parent in our society, right? You get judged, right? Like if you work, then you don't value your children. If you stay at home, then you don't really work. And what is your job? Um, so there's a double standard there no matter what you do. But for me as a working parent, I've really tried to view my time with my kids as quality over quantity.
Yes.
Um, and really just making sure that I'm carving out those special moments, those memorable times with them. And when I do have time with them, really trying to make it like high quality time.
Yeah. Huge. Well, thank you for all those things. I think they're each individually like a significant piece, right? Around like being aware of like who the supervisor is that you work for and how that person is going to support you,
Mhm.
especially if you're looking for a new job or you're going back to work. Like that being a high priority is to work for someone who creates that setting and that culture. And then to your
Absolutely.
point, like models it. And if they're not modeling it, that you are able to sort of lift that up to them and say, hey, when I see you taking days off and then showing up at meetings, that tells me I can't do that, right? Like that's such a huge thing that happens, especially in American culture. Um,
Mhm.
and being able to manage up as well as down, as you said. Yeah, I think all those pieces, the boundaries, of course, huge, and just being willing to mess up, like you said, and sort of start again um, and try it differently the next time. So, um, I think the last piece that I just wanted to ask you was if there's any sort of major takeaways or things that really stuck with you from your coaching journey that you want to share in terms of like how this had an impact on your work or your life.
Yeah, I think there are two things that I would say I use every day, and one is just I'm a much more effective supervisor, um, and how I show up, and I try to lead with, grace, leading with grace and curiosity,
Hmm.
and really like looking at the individuals that I'm working with and thinking about them as like holistic
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Um, because as I was going through all of these crazy things, and they are too, like they're going through crazy things, and we're all like people
Yeah.
first. um so I think really like, I've had to have a shift in my mindset. I was talking about boundaries, and it was not something that was easy for me to like to walk the walk, right? And say that I'm not going to work when I'm not supposed to be working.
Yeah.
Like, it's ingrained in us that if you're hardworking, you're working even when you're not supposed to. Or like, what does a hard worker or a good worker look like? Um, those are things I've had to unlearn. Like, even when I've
Mm.
had direct reports or members of the team be like, "Oh, I was supposed to do this thing, but I can't do it, and here's why." Being like annoyed, and then being like, take a step back, like take a step back, and you know just like being okay with that.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
it's definitely like a behavior I've had to unlearn, that
Hmm.
frustration. I think the biggest thing that I kind of take away from coaching is like intentional reflection, which is not really something that we're taught to do very well. It's something I'm trying to teach my children to do.
Hmm.
um but when you're in a fast-paced culture, right? And you're moving from fire to fire to fire. Reflection and sitting down with your thoughts and planning how you want to show up in a space, how you want to show up in a meeting, how you want to interact with other people is like your last priority. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's been really important for me to prioritize reflection and spend time thinking about how I'm going to show up in a meeting, especially if I know that that meeting um, is going to be challenging.
Yeah.
And that's that, like, again, like, is true for my personal life, is true for my professional life. Like,
Hmm.
I'm somebody who needs to write, so I will literally write things out. Like, this is what I want to say,
Right.
and think about it from that other person's perspective and really just reflect.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think like a theme that I hear through both of those pieces of, insight is this notion of like slowing down and having more space, which again is not something we're taught, but
Mhm.
is so often a big shift that people experience in coaching in any number of topics, right? But for you, it shows up in your leadership, in your parenting, in your life, in these various ways. But it's actually sort of this simple idea. It's just not easy to do without
Yeah.
practice. So thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else that you want to tell folks or share before we close out?
I think I've shared most of what I wanted to. I do just want to say thank you to Ellen, because I think the work that you do is holistic. That's the type of work that I try to do. And entering into coaching, I kind of thought like, oh, this will be like very much about who I am as a professional, and it really like opened up just a world for me, and it kind of all came, it's meant to be, came at the right time,
It did.
in the pandemic. And yeah, I mean, I use what I learned in coaching every day. So thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that and just for your openness and your vulnerability along the way. I know that this is not easy work to do, and as you say, it's often more sort of holistic than people imagine when they begin something that they think is just about their work. But we're whole people, as you said, and so how do we invite that in? And I think you and I did that beautifully, if I can say that. But it takes a lot, and so just wanting to thank you for all that you showed up for and the longevity of this over the years, right? Your commitment to yourself is really something admirable. So thank you for being on the journey. And I'll just say for folks who want to find out more about coaching, one thing you could do is schedule a discovery call so you can just have a free conversation with me, tell me more about what you're up against or what's struggling or where you're struggling, and we can see whether it feels like a good fit. That's one option. You could also check out the Career Refresh mini series, which is just a 2-session coaching package just to give you a little taste and for us to dive into where you're feeling stuck in your work. Or you could also send me a DM with questions. That's very possible too. Very easy to chat that way. The first 2 pieces, you can find the links for that in my bio. So just go ahead and click the link there and you'll see both the discovery call booking and also the Career Refresh mini series. And that is all for us today. So thank you for tuning in, for sticking with us. And for those who are watching after, we hope that you enjoyed this conversation too. Please feel free to send us more questions if you have them, and have a great rest of your day. Happy Valentine's Day.
Bye.